What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in today's episode is Agathe Demarais, the Global Forecasting Director at the Economist Intelligence Unit and author of Backfire, a book about the global ripple effects of U.S. sanctions and the steps that targeted countries are taking to insulate themselves from the U.S. financial and trading system. This episode is part of a series that I've been putting together on the U.S. dollar, deglobalization or reglobalization, and the evolving impact of great power competition on global trade and finance. You can find other such related podcasts on this week's episode page at hiddenforces.io. In the first hour of our conversation, Agathe and I discussed the origins and evolution of U.S. sanctions policy and how it has been applied successfully and unsuccessfully in countries like Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Russia. Our discussion on Russian sanctions in particular leads us into the second hour, where we also explore the subject of export controls and the U.S. Commerce Department's recent announcement that it would be restricting the ability of China's economy to obtain or otherwise manufacture certain high-end semiconductor chips used in military applications and presumably, given the dual-use nature of this technology, commercial applications as well. We also discuss what China, Russia, and other members of this emergent coalition of states, united by their hostility towards the prevailing American-led international order, are doing to try and insulate their economies and financial systems from the US dollar and Western trade and financial sanctions. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second half of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your phone using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this truly unique and excellent conversation with my guest, Agathe Demarais. Agathe Demarais, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Agathe, before we get into the topic of today's conversation, which is sanctions, tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got into writing a book about U.S. sanctions policy.
So my name is Agathe Demarais. As you said, I'm French and I'm the Global Forecasting Director at the Economist Intelligence Unit based in London. Essentially, I do economic and political forecasting. But before that, I was a French Treasury official and I was based in Moscow and in Lebanon. And I was actually based in Moscow in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and started to back separatist rebels in the Donbass region. And so from one day to another, I was previously covering Russia and Central Asia and Ukraine for economic and financial matters. And from one day to another, I was part of a small sanctions task force tasked with imposing sanctions, the first ever sanctions on Russia. And that was my intro to sanctions. And at the time, it was really interesting. It was a completely new topic for me. And it was also an opportunity to see that sanctions had ripple effects beyond Russia, because we would get these meetings from European companies, these meeting requests, and they would tell us, okay, sanctions are important, but they also have an impact on our operations. And so we at the French Treasury needed to take that into account. And after Moscow, I moved to Lebanon. And I was there actually in 2014 covering Iran when the nuclear deal was signed. I was covering Iran, I was covering Syria, I was covering Iraq and a number of other Middle Eastern countries at the time. So again, a lot of work on sanctions. And in 2017, I did what nobody ever does. I left the French civil service, job for life, and I joined the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. And here again, I could see that sanctions had ripple effects on commodities markets, for instance. I'm sure we're we're going to discuss all of this. And so that's how the idea about my book germinated, that sanctions have effects on their targets, but they also have ripple effects and side effects. And I thought it would be very interesting to study them in the book.
So what made you so interested in sanctions in the first place?
Well, I think sanctions are fascinating. Well, not really surprisingly, because I wrote an entire book about them. I think that what is really interesting with sanctions is that they span a host of different topics. So you can study sanctions from the economic angle. So for instance, when you take a look at the impact of the recent price cap on Russian oil exports, so you can see some economic consequences, but you can also take a look at diplomacy, because sanctions are a diplomatic tool to pressure a country to do things differently. You can also take a look at the financial perspective, because sanctions are implemented by banks around the world. They are a financial instrument. You can take a look at the humanitarian impact. Some people do that when they study sanctions. For instance, I discuss in my book how sanctions can have an impact on the population of targeted countries. I studied the case of Iran during the COVID pandemic and asked the question of whether sanctions made it more difficult for Iran to respond to the pandemic. The short answer is it's complicated. So you see, you have all of these topics. You can also discuss technology. That's something that I do in the book. Actually, the last third of the book is about recent export controls from the US on China's import of semiconductors. So you can see that there are a lot of different things, a lot of different ways to see sanctions. And I find them fascinating because, you can take a look at them from these various angles, and also they have side effects, they have ripple effects, they have an impact on you, on me, on everyone around the world. And I found that this was understudied. And that's also why I wanted to write the book.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into export controls, because that also is going to complement a lot of the work that we've done on semiconductors. And we did one episode in particular with Chris Miller that was a look at the entire global supply chain for semiconductors and the impact of the geostrategic competition between the U.S. and China on that industry. And shortly after we released that episode, the U.S. put some really stringent export controls on semiconductors. So definitely something I want to talk about. I feel like when people hear about sanctions, they enter through the cognitive framework of diplomacy. But actually, if I had to choose between these two, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say, because in the book you say they're kind of in between diplomacy and war. But if I had to choose between one or the other, I would say that they are a form of warfare, because they're so devastating and can be very devastating on various economies. I mean, Iran is like a great example. How would you characterize what sanctions are and how we should think about them as tools of diplomacy or coercion?
Well, I think that's an excellent intro question. I think that sanctions are both a diplomatic tool and a form of warfare. I think that we would definitely agree on that. I think that essentially sanctions fill in a void between, on the one hand of the diplomatic spectrum, empty diplomatic declarations. So, for instance, a condemnation of the war in Ukraine. But I don't think that any diplomatic declaration is going to have much of an impact on someone like Vladimir Putin or any other dictator. And on the other end of the diplomatic spectrum, you have military intervention. But obviously, these are deadly, these are costly, these have a huge political impact also. So both options, I would say, are unpopular or have significant limitations. And in the middle, well, you have nothing but sanctions. And I think that this is why sanctions are so important and why sanctions have become so popular in recent years, because they fill in this void. So I think they are a diplomatic tool as part of broader packages. I think sometimes people have unrealistic expectations of sanctions, and it has certainly been the case with Russia recently. Some people expecting the collapse of the Russian economy. I don't think this was ever the goal. It's just impossible, for instance, to have the collapse of the 9th largest economy in the world, which Russia is. But I think that as part of broader diplomatic packages, sanctions are a tool among others. And they are also a form of warfare, exactly as you say, because they are replacing military interventions, but they do have an impact on the ground, on the livelihood of people. I actually discuss in my book, again, the example of Iran and how sanctions can impede access to some medicines, for instance. And this is very, very significant. And so there are a bit of everything. And it goes back to your earlier question question. That's why I find sanctions so fascinating, because they are really a multifaceted tool, which I think is really interesting to study.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I would hope that collapsing the Russian economy was not the objective. I don't think that actually serves American interests. So one thing that I want to do is I want to actually look at specific cases where the U.S. has applied sanctions. And we might be able to do that as part of tracing the evolution of sanctions, perhaps, because one of the things that you do so well in the book is you outline how sanctions evolved from when we applied them in the case of North Korea, Iran, Russia in 2014, et cetera. But what are the origins of sanctions going back even before the U.S. began using them so prolifically? And what is the larger category of economic statecraft, diplomacy, or war that they fall into?
Yeah, it does. It does very well. Actually, I would say that the idea of sanctions is as old as civilization, pretty much. We can date back the first sanctions to the ancient Greek era, with actually Pericles imposing an embargo on the Greek city of Megara to protest against the abduction of two women. So you can see it was a trade embargo, but still you had the germs of recent modern sanctions. So really as old as civilization. And then you had some blockades. Napoleon, for instance, the French emperor imposed a blockade against Great Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. Again, the same idea, a trade embargo. Well, that was actually the only sanction at the time that really existed. And that's also what was imposed against Cuba in 1960 by the US. Well, stringent trade embargo. I think that this is an interesting one to study, because obviously it hasn't really yielded the results that the US was hoping. But I would say these were the main cases also with the embargo against North Korea after the Korean War. But sanctions recently have completely changed. They're not trade embargoes anymore. There are no financial sanctions. And actually the story of how the US invented financial sanctions, it's very interesting, because it was almost randomly. It actually was after September 11, 9/11, that the US was closely tracking some financial flows for the war against terror. And in doing so, I think it was in 2003, the US detected that a small bank in Macau called Banco Delta Asia was the sole financial conduit for North Korea with the rest of the world. And essentially, North Korea, Pyongyang, was using this bank to conduct illicit activities, to launder money, because, well, North Korea is one of the most skilled countries to forge $100 banknotes. And it was using this bank as its sole financial conduit with the rest of the world. And so there was a ha moment, I would say, within OFAC, which is the US Treasury agency in charge of conceiving and implementing sanctions. There was this ha moment of, wait, if we cut Banco Delta Asia's access to the rest of the financial world, well, then we would deal a severe blow to Pyongyang. And that was the invention of financial sanctions, almost randomly. And since then, well, the US has imposed more sanctions against more targets. We've seen, obviously, Iran up to the conclusion of the nuclear deal. Then there was Russia. Then there was Venezuela, all cases that I discuss in the book. But these sanctions are financial ones. What it means is that their implementation rests on the ability of banks to check the compliance of all the transactions that they process with US financial sanctions. So very different from the historical trade embargoes that we had in the previous centuries.
So let's actually look at Banco Delta Asia and maybe compare it to what the US did with North Korea, and in order to understand really how sanctions work and how they've evolved. Because with North Korea, as I understand it, they had one interface to the outside financial system, which was this one particular bank, which they used as a conduit through which to do business with the rest of the world. In the case of Iran, their private sector is much larger, and there are many more relationships with banks outside of Iran, and have been, rather. And so sanctioning Iran was more complicated than was sanctioning North Korea. Can you tell us how this happened? Like, specifically, what did financial sanctions mean in the case of North Korea? And then how did they evolve in the case of Iran?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. That's actually a transition, I think, in chapter 2 of my book. I essentially explained that targeting North Korea is a far easier endeavor than targeting Iran. North Korea is a small economy and it relied on a single foreign, not North Korean, bank to do business with the rest of the world or to conduct illicit financial activities. Iran was an entirely different beast because when the US and the EU started to target Iran very seriously, I would say in the 2010s, because of Iran's nuclear activities, well, Iran was a large exporter of energy products. It was also a big trade partner for European countries. It wasn't the case with the US, but it was the case with Europe. And also, there were a number of Iranian banks that were well connected to the global financial system with European banks, but also Middle Eastern banks, for instance, in Dubai. So it was an entirely different problem, an entirely different beast. And actually, that's very interesting because then we can see afterwards the US turned its sights to Russia, which is an entirely different beast, even compared to Iran, even bigger. And so what the US did is that it started to target Iranian financial institutions directly. And the idea here was, again, financial isolation. Well, that's what had happened with North Korea after the US had targeted Banco Delta Asia. But to achieve this with Iran, it took the US, much more work because the US had to target every single Iranian bank that was doing business with the rest of the world. And so that was obviously a much larger endeavor. And what happened is that the US did this, but it still didn't yield a lot of results. So in 2012, the US actually pressured SWIFT, which is the global cooperative that processes pretty much every financial transactions around the world. Well, that actually connects banks with each other to process financial transactions. It's like a global Rolodex of banks. And it put pressure on SWIFT so that SWIFT would disconnect Iranian financial institutions from its network. And that step was at first opposed by SWIFT, of course, and the European Union, but the US had the upper hand because SWIFT can't really afford to be disconnected from the US dollar. And so that's exactly what happened from 2012. And that put Iran into almost complete financial isolation. And there was actually an economic crisis afterwards in Iran. Growth collapsed. The rial, which is the Iranian currency, also collapsed. And there was very, very high inflation. And that's actually very interesting to mention this because the point of sanctions is to impose economic pain on the population of targeted countries. So they will force their government to change course. And that's exactly what happened in Iran. A few months afterwards, the Iranian population elected, for Iranian standards, a reformist, Hassan Rouhani, who had pledged that he would get sanctions lifted by signing a deal with Western countries. That's exactly what he did, and sanctions were lifted after the conclusion of the Iran nuclear deal in 2015.
So that actually touches on a couple of questions I had. One was, is the goal of sanctions always roughly the same, to exert pressure on a ruling government in order to get them to change their policy? Or can goals be broader? And do they need to be clearly articulated? And how important is it to articulate goals publicly in order to achieve specific policy objectives?
Well, that's a big question and a very important question. So I think there's a lot to unpack here. So the first thing is that sanctions can have many, many different goals. I think that sometimes the goal is regime change. I think this was the case with Cuba, with the trade embargo that we mentioned earlier. The US at the time imposed sanctions to protest against Cuba's nationalization of some US refineries. I think that this was an excuse. The US was uncomfortable of having an ally to the Soviet Union at the time, only a few miles from Florida's coast. So you can have regime change. The problem here is that it almost never works. You can also impose sanctions, as we've just discussed in the case of Iran, to impose economic pain, to convince a country to change course, to change its policy. I think that this was exactly what happened in Iran. You can also have sanctions when they are imposed against a bigger economy, such as Russia at the moment. These sanctions, I would say, against Russia Russia are aiming at waiving on Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine. It's not about a collapse of the Russian economy. It's not about regime change. There is no reason to believe that a potential successor to Vladimir Putin would change course in Ukraine. It's also not about stopping war in Ukraine, at least directly. It's about making it more complicated for Russia to wage war against its neighbor, both from the economic and financial perspective, essentially provoking a recession of the Russian economy, and also the technological perspective by constraining Russia's ability to access semiconductors. And Russian missiles are full of Western-made semiconductors. At least they used to be, because Russia is probably starting to have some problems to replenish the stocks. So you can see that there are a lot of different objectives potentially. And also another objective is almost always to send a diplomatic message. I think this is very clear in the case of Russia at the moment, and I think it's a clear goal of sanctions to say, well, you can't invade your neighbor and expect Western democracy to stand still. So I think there are a variety of goals, and that's what makes studying the impact of sanctions so interesting, because it's really a case-by-case thing. Then to your question about whether the goals of sanctions need to be articulated very precisely, I think they need to be, and I think that's a key problem because they aren't in many cases. This is certainly the case for Russia. I don't think that there is any certainty about the goals of sanctions against Russia. I was saying that they're about waiving on Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine, but this hasn't been described very, very precisely. And I think that's a problem, because then you can have the narrative that is actually fueled by Russian propaganda that sanctions don't work. If we don't know their objectives, it's very easy to claim that they don't work. And also the other issue, as I discussed in the book, is that you want the impacts and the objectives of sanctions to be very clear. So the targeted country knows exactly what it needs to do to get sanctions lifted. If you want to use sanctions as leverage, it's exactly the same as, telling a child, if you do this, you will be punished, but if you behave correctly, well, punishment will be lifted. Well, it's exactly the same. If the targeted country doesn't know exactly what it needs to do to see sanctions being lifted, well, maybe it will have less incentives to comply, which I think is a key issue. So I would say definitely that the goals of sanctions need to be clearly explained and articulated. But unfortunately, this is not the case very often. Also because sanctions are often imposed in a rush, and I speak here from experience. You can be told, okay, we need new sanctions against target X, and we need them essentially for yesterday. And so you would impose sanctions in a rush and then refine them.
Also, as you write in the book, sanctions are much easier to put on than they are to take off. You can formally take them off, but that doesn't necessarily resolve the problems that were initiated as a result of putting on the sanctions. I'm also kind of struck by how successful non-military forms of coercion and statecraft have been in the case of Iran and America's efforts to influence the trajectory of its nuclear program. And I'm not just thinking about sanctions here. The U.S.-Israeli efforts with Stuxnet were also enormously successful. What would you say explains the success that sanctions have had in that case?
Yeah, I think sanctions have been the most successful way to compel Iran to sign the nuclear deal, just because, and I think it's the case among all dictatorship and theocracies like Iran, I think that their leaders are very worried about popular resentment. And I think that in the case of Iran, there was a clear case for the population to say sanctions have an impact on our livelihoods. They are fueling inflation. They are fueling an economic collapse. We used to have decent living standards in the past. This is not the case anymore. We want sanctions being lifted. But I think that the clear and key thing here is that the Iranian population had a way to signal its displeasure. So obviously, Iran has a dismal human rights record, but there are still some presidential elections in Iran that give the Iranian population some limited say in governance. So I think that this link, this way for the population to signal its displeasure was really key. And that's what would get me worried about sanctions on Russia. I think they're critically important. I think they are degrading Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine. But I'm not sure that we will be able to see the same thing in Russia, because I don't think at the moment, given Russia's control on the media, given also how scared the Russian population is of its leadership, I don't think that the Russian population is in a position to say we want this war to be over because the economy is in a bad place.
Yeah, I also want to emphasize for listeners who may have missed this in the introduction that the larger question that animated this conversation is whether the overuse of sanctions can actually be detrimental to long-term U.S. strategic power and diplomatic influence. So I want to kind of put that out there before we continue. But before we get to that, another question with respect to goals. Actually, not just goals, but also targets. One, are there ideal targets? So you kind of hinted at that countries that have more developed democratic institutions or pathways for public expression of public opinion are actually more easy to pressure using sanctions. So that's one question. Are there ideal targets? What makes them ideal besides just the democratic aspect? And are there certain goals that are better to have than others or that are easier to achieve than others? And then let's actually use that to talk a little bit more about Russia specifically and what we do know about what the goals of the administration are with respect to the use of sanctions in Russia.
Okay, so big question again. Yes, we know actually what the best potential target for sanctions is. And I would define best here as the target for which sanctions would be the most effective. There are actually, if we take a look at history, there are 5 criteria to try to guess whether sanctions are going to be effective. Obviously, it's always very hard because we don't have the counterfactual, we don't have the counter narrative of what would have happened without sanctions. But still, we can see the first thing is that sanctions work best when they are imposed for a short period of time, usually less than 2 years, because otherwise we tend to see some adaptation of the target to sanctions. And the second thing is, and it goes back to everything that we were discussing a few minutes ago, it is better if sanctions have a very clear objective, for instance, the release of a political prisoner. And actually, sanctions that combine these two goals are sanctions that the US imposed in 2018 against Turkey to get the release of a US pastor, Andrew Brunson. These sanctions were imposed for a short period of time against Turkey, and they had a very clear, explicit, and narrow goal: getting the pastor released. And it worked. So these are the first 2 criteria. The third criteria, and actually the Turkey case also fits this criteria, is that sanctions work best when they're imposed against a country with which one, and the US, obviously in that case, has extensive ties. And it also was the case with Turkey, extensive trade ties, extensive military ties through NATO. Because obviously, if you target a country with which you have no ties, well, sanctions are not going to be able to cut any links if there weren't links in the first place. So this is also quite significant. The fourth criteria, and we've already touched upon it, is that sanctions work better when they are imposed against a democracy, or at least a country that has a multi-party electoral system. This is something that is really important, so the population can have a say in governance and be able to say, we don't like the impact of sanctions. We want things to change. We want our government to do things differently. That's the fourth criteria. And the fifth criteria is about multilateralism. It's a big thing in my book that I do believe that the most effective sanctions that the US can impose are sanctions that the US imposes with its allies, be it the European Union, Japan, Australia, Canada, other like-minded countries. I think that such sanctions are much more difficult to draft because everyone has to be on board. So obviously they're often less stringent than unilateral US sanctions, obviously, because everyone needs to be on board and everyone has different economic interests. But these are much, much harder to circumvent. And even China wouldn't be able to lose access to both the US and EU and other Western markets. That would be very difficult, even for such a big economic power as China. So actually, I think that these 5 criteria show something. You want sanctions to be multilateral, you want sanctions to be imposed for a short time, narrow objective, democratic multi-party electoral system, and against a country with which you have a lot of ties. Now, to go to your question about the goals of recent sanctions against Russia, I should say here that Russia is an entirely different beast. Like I can see how sanctions have evolved, targeting first small economy like Cuba, and then North Korea, and then Iran, which was much bigger, but still much smaller than Russia. Russia is the 9th largest economy in the world. And so in terms of the objectives of sanctions, I think that there are 3 objectives of recent sanctions against Russia. I think the first one, and we've touched upon this already, is about the diplomatic message. It's about a message of resolve, of unity, of standing with Ukraine. I don't think that Putin was expecting such transatlantic unity on sanctions between the US and the EU, because there have been a lot of sanctions disputes in the past that I actually discuss in the book. And in my view, these are very dangerous because they only ever benefit countries under sanctions like Russia. I mean, you can be sure that Russia and Vladimir Putin, that he rejoices every time he sees a crack in the Western alliance, notably on sanctions. And this happened a lot in the past, for instance, over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline saga that I discuss at length in the book from a European perspective. So this message of diplomatic unity resolve, I think, was the first objective of sanctions against Russia, the recent ones. The second objective, and I've mentioned this already, it's about making it more difficult for Russia to wage war against Ukraine. And I think it is working perfectly, actually. I think that it is very clear that the Russian economy is not in a good place. It is on track to it recorded a recession last year in 2022. It is on track to record a recession again this year, which is very significant because usually when an economy records a recession in a given year, then in the following year, it rebounds. That's almost automatic. It's very rare that a country would post a recession 2 years in a row. And so what that means is that things are going to get more difficult gradually for Russian regime. Of course, it has reserves. It still has around $300 billion in foreign exchange reserves. It has a sovereign wealth fund. But these reserves are probably, slowly going to get smaller and smaller. And so the Russian regime will have to make choices, because they want social stability, but at the same time, waging war is very costly. And obviously, Russia won't be able to raise any money on capital markets. So at some point, they will need to make a choice. And it is a bit of the same story in the technological field. Russia is running on its reserves here for semiconductors. For its missiles, we know that they need to use semiconductors that use Western technology, and Russia's access to these semiconductors is cut at the moment. So it still has reserves, but at some point, these are going to run dry. So that was the second objective, making it more difficult. And this will be slow, this will be gradual, this will be a slow process. And then the third objective of sanctions against Russia, and I actually discussed this in the book, I argue in the book that the most stringent sanctions ever imposed against Russia were actually imposed from 2014. And these target the Russian energy sector in 2 ways. They make it more difficult for Russian energy sector to get access to money and to technology from Western countries. And this is very significant because a lot of Russian energy fields are currently, coming to what we call maturity. That is to say that their reserves are running low, and Russia will need to be able to develop new fields, for instance, in the Arctic, to replenish its reserves and to remain a global energy superpower. But without access to financing and without access to top-notch Western technology, this will be extremely difficult, especially for fields in the Arctic. And so there is a risk, and actually that's the point of sanctions, that we will see a slow asphyxiation of the Russian energy sector. Of course, China is going to be able to help in some ways, but it won't be able to help fully, notably when it comes to technology. And I think that this is a real existential threat for the Kremlin, and they know it. They won't have any easy fix for that. And actually, when we take a look at the data from the International Energy Agency, at the moment, around 30% of globally traded energy comes from Russia, but this share will fall to 15% by 2030, which is essentially tomorrow. And that means that Russia will lose its status as a global energy superpower, which I think is a very significant development.
So, a lot to respond here to. The first thing that you said about the purpose of sanctions, one of them in the case of Russia is to not just punish Russia post facto for its invasion of Ukraine, but to send a message to China that if it were to do something similar to Taiwan, that the consequences would be severe. Because again, it's about providing a credible deterrent. One, would you agree with that that was part of what was at work in sanctioning Russia as hard as they sanctioned it?
Absolutely. I think absolutely, because everybody knows that China is watching very closely what the Western answer and what the Western response has been to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. I think that this goes to the bargaining function of sanctions, and I think that it has two ways that this works. The first way is that sanctions can be used as leverage, essentially, saying, if you do this, we will do that. Okay. But sanctions can also be a deterrent, exactly as you've said. And there were some discussions, for instance, I thought of including this in the book, but in the end I didn't. But I remember still, I had researched it, that in 2014, when Russia first started its aggression against Ukraine, to back rebels in the Donbass region, and after it annexed Crimea, there were some messages that were communicated very clearly to Moscow from Western countries that if it were to escalate further, then Russia could be cut off from SWIFT overnight. Well, we don't know if this threat that worked, but at the time, Russia didn't escalate. Of course, 8 years later, it certainly escalated its aggression against Ukraine. And so I think that this deterrent effect is very, very important. And actually, Western countries still have a lot of leverage against Russia because we're not at full max power for Western sanctions against Russia. When we take a look at the Iran playbook, we can see that the US still has some leeway, for instance, with secondary sanctions. There are none against Russia at the moment, except for the Russian military sector, but these are fairly limited. So the US could impose secondary sanctions against Russia, for instance, or there could be some restrictions on Russia's use to use the US dollar. Russia could still be cut off entirely from SWIFT. This is not the case at the moment. So this is all about the deterrence. And I think that this is very important. Essentially, Western countries still have some dry power. And as you've mentioned, well, China is watching because we all know that there is a risk that China will make moves against Taiwan in the coming decade. I think that this threat will be especially acute from the years 2030. Well, we forecast that China is going to become the world's largest economic power. I think our latest data from the Economist Intelligence Unit show that this crossover will happen in 2037. We don't really care the exact year. What really matters is that it is going to happen as per the latest economic projections. And this will certainly change China's calculus towards Taiwan. And this will be a very dangerous moment. And I think the point of the book is to say we need to make sure that sanctions will still be an effective tool at the time, because we're seeing a lot of developments, notably from China, that will make sanctions potentially ineffective. And I would be very worried to live in a world where Russia has invaded Ukraine and China has ambitions regarding Taiwan, but financial sanctions have become completely ineffective. I think that would be a very dangerous world to live in.
So that's actually what I want to devote the second part of our conversation to. Before we do that, I want to clarify a few more things. One, you said that Russia still has foreign exchange reserves. If memory serves, about half of their forex reserves were frozen after their invasion. Is that roughly correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Russia had about $640 billion in foreign exchange reserves before the invasion, and Western countries were able to freeze half of that. But I think this is critical, and I'm sure this is a good segue for the second part of our discussion, because they were able to freeze only half of Russia's reserves. And why is that? Because the other half is held in renminbi, in gold, in rupees, in other non-Western currencies. And so the US and the EU and other Western aligned countries, they don't have any capacity to freeze foreign exchange reserves that are not denominated in their own currencies.
So, okay, again, that's a really great point, and that's something I want to talk about. With respect to sanctions evasion, so we talked about the importance of multilateral sanctions and how those are much more difficult to evade. The sanctions against Russia have been multilateral, but Russia has still been able to sell oil and, I guess, liquefied natural gas as well on the international market. Granted, it's impacted, they've had to sell it at a discount. how effective have these sanctions been, and how much have the Russians evaded them? And how much is the evasion kind of part of the plan around the sanctions, which is the desire to generate a discount in the market, but not necessarily to get the oil off of the market?
Okay, that's a very, very big question. So I think I would say something first. I'm not sure I would qualify sanctions against Russia as multilateral. I think that multilateral sanctions would be those imposed under the UN. Notably, for instance, we see that against North Korea. And actually, it's critical here to remember that, well, obviously, Russia is the permanent member of the UN Security Council, so is China. And so we're not seeing UN sanctions against Russia.
So when you say when you use the word multilateral, you don't mean that it has to be a coalition. You mean specifically it needs to be a global coalition of countries that form sort of the core members on the Security Council, or how do you mean it when you use that word?
So I would say here, and actually I discussed this in the final part of the book, we will never get Russia and China and Iran and Venezuela on board to do multilateral sanctions against each other. But I think that there is a case to have new multilateral sanctions that would be imposed under some institution. Something would need to be created, a global sanctions framework. There would be like-minded countries. Of course, there would be the US, the EU, Japan, and other Western democracies. I think that this would make sanctions very effective. I think if we define multilateral sanctions in a very stringent way, I think these would be imposed under the aegis of the UN. And I think that's important to remember that this is not the case against Russia. And actually 2/3 of the world's population live in countries that are either neutral or Russia-leaning when it comes to Ukraine. And I think that's an important data point because it means that Russia still has some deep pockets of support, especially in emerging countries. It is using resentment against Western countries in the emerging world to fuel its propaganda that sanctions don't work, that they actually have bad effects. I mean, this is not true in the specific cases that Russia is mentioning. Sanctions are not fueling food insecurity, crucially. But I think it's important to recognize that there isn't at the moment a huge global coalition to sanctions Russia. Actually, 2/3 of the world's population live in countries that don't impose sanctions against Russia.
Has anyone gamed out the long-term impact of decapitalizing the Russian oil and gas sector, what that would mean, not just for the availability of oil, usually talked about from a supply side, but also from a demand side, and what impact that would have on global growth?
I think it would be very, very significant, just because, as we have mentioned, about 30% of globally traded energy products are Russian at the moment. So obviously, we're seeing that there is an embargo on Russian oil imposed by Western countries at the moment. There is also the G7 oil price cap that makes it, well, theoretically impossible to buy oil above the price of $60 per barrel. I think that if all of Russian energy were to be taken out of the market from one day to another, then the consequences would be very important. And actually, that's exactly the debate that was happening between the US and the EU before late 2022, so fairly recently. I think the US has always been much more willing to impose stringent sanctions on the Russian energy sector and on Russian energy exports. But the EU was still saying, wait, we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot. We still need Russian energy. At some point, Russian energy was about 30% of the energy mix in Europe. So that was obviously very significant. And actually, you can see that Putin's bet has badly backfired because he has solved the problem. He has solved Europe's dilemma by cutting the gas flow to Europe. Europe didn't want that to happen. There are no sanctions in Europe targeting the import of Russian gas. But by cutting the gas flow, well, Putin has solved the problem for Europe. And I think that he has definitely solved the headache for the European Union. But in the longer run, I think that this bet would badly backfire for him because it will mean that Russia's status as a global energy superpower, well, is not going to remain forever. And so that leads me to actually the second part of my response to your question. If we were to take out all of Russian energy supplies out of the market from one day to another, I think we would see a big spike in oil and gas prices, not only actually for energy, but also for other commodities. Of course, Russia is producing a lot of base metals, precious metals, gold, fertilizers, food. But I think that the bet from Western countries is to do this in a very slow and gradual way. And that would obviously have less of an impact, less of a shock impact on markets. And again, we go back to these statistics from the International Energy Agency. By 2030, well, only 15% of globally traded oil and gas will be from Russia. So we will see some effects. We are seeing a decoupling of Russia from global supply chains, at least from Western supply chains. This will be significant, but it will take some time.
So Agathe, I'm going to move us to the second part of this conversation. I want to continue our discussion about Russia and what some of the long-term effects are that we can expect on the Russian economy, and also to what degree we can begin to walk those back as part of some larger settlement over Ukraine. I also want to discuss export controls, as I said, as with respect to the semiconductor industry, and also what these countries are doing to further sanction-proof themselves, and how, to the larger point of your book, the use and overuse of sanctions can actually run counter to U.S. interests and what that would mean for the long term. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Agathe, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers get access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Agathe, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.